Well, thank you so much for watching Morning Live. Now, the People's United Democratic Movement, or PUDEMO, has strongly condemned the purchase of 19 Rolls Royce vehicles bought by Swazi King for the exclusive use of himself, his mother and his wives. Now, each Rolls Royce is worth about 10 million rand, and this all apparently took place during student protests that have led to the closure of tertiary institutions in Eswatini. Now, the protests are due to a failure by government to pay student expenses for the past 2 months, and public servants for their part have also taken to the streets demanding better salaries. Mlungisi Makhanya, who is president of the People's United Democratic Movement, PUDEMO, joins us now to talk more about this. Thanks so much for coming through.
Thank you very much, Swazi King, and good morning.
So you were telling me you just got here in the early hours of this morning. So what is the situation like in Swaziland, Eswatini?
The situation is quite tense. Our people are extremely angered and upset by the recent acquisition of these luxury vehicles. But also for us, we are quite excited as a movement because we have been vindicated for what we have been saying for almost 4 decades now, that the monarchy in Swaziland is extremely parasitic and its lavish lifestyle is financed through the raiding of the public purse. But I think it would be important, Sakina, to take a step back in contextualizing exactly what is happening in Swaziland. Because you would remember that after 2011, where Swaziland experienced deep financial crisis, all of us were asked to tighten our belts and accept that the country is in a financial crisis and everyone else must come to the party. You remember the country even approached South Africa for a 2.5 billion bailout, of which we successfully lobbied South Africa that even if it were to give that bailout, it can't give it unconditionally, because what has been happening is that all the monies that come from SACCO receipts, instead of being directed into developmental issues of the country, that directed into financing the lavish lifestyle of the king. So what happened then is that the king was able to get a bit of finances from Taiwan and some of the Arab states. What subsequently happened is that there were quite a lot of reforms that took place. There were reforms of the revenue agencies. There were reforms where government had to cut some of the excesses that it was doing. But then what has happened over the time is that as the finances improved, we have seen the king back raiding the public purse. But even before the finances could improve, Swaziland went on a huge borrowing spree and lied to say this money is being borrowed to finance infrastructural development. But what we realized was that that money was being raised so that it can continue financing Mswati's lavish lifestyle. So all infrastructural projects that happened in Swaziland between 2011 and now have had huge cost overruns. You talk about the building of the Skupe Airport, you talk about the building of the freeways, you talk about the current construction of the International Convention Center and the 5-star hotel, that when it started, it was estimated to cost the fiscals 2.2 billion, who are currently approaching 6 billion. And it is because precisely is using this so-called capital project finance to raid them so that it can get money over and above what is already looting from the national fiscus. And that explains why even the Minister of Finance couldn't give an explanation to Parliament when he was asked about this recent acquisition and said he will need time to go and research, because he didn't know what was happening. So that is the state of affairs in Swaziland. So
Swaziland, of course, is an absolute monarchy. Yes. And, you know, that, of course, comes with its own attendant issues and consequences, as evidenced right now. But as an opposition party, you know, do you feel as though you literally are, to borrow a phrase that our Auditor General in South Africa was quite fond of, like you're wrestling a pig in the mud, because you are complaining about this now? Last year, King Mswati bought himself a jet to celebrate his 50th birthday, $13.2 million that cost, and we can go back. I remember the whole brouhaha around his purchasing of the Maybach when that came out. So this is not new by any means, but what does it mean within the context of the socio-political Swati demeanor, as it were? What's going on in the country?
You're absolutely correct. It is not new. But unfortunately, in a nation, people don't respond with the same sense of urgency all the time. But what this recent scandal has done, it has helped to mobilize even a lot of the conservatives who were on the side of the king defending him, who have come up. If you can see what is on the recent newspapers in Swaziland, they were talking about the highly censored media space in Swaziland that has begun to write to say this must just come to an end. Actually, we came from last night from a big meeting of civil society, faith-based leaders, students, leaders, and a variety of other stakeholders in the civil society, where we've agreed on a mass rolling action that we will be initiating starting from Wednesday. And the message is clear. Everyone is saying now the time has come that this monarchy must go. So people are clear that...
But go where? As we say, Eswatini is an absolute monarchy. So what do you propose be done with the monarchy?
Look, our proposal is very clear, is that let power in Swaziland shift to the people. We need to make sure that the power rests with the people as opposed to having power rest with one individual, the monarch. And everyone is rallying behind that call because they've seen that the monarchy in Swaziland is sustained at the expenses of the nation. Now, what we need to appreciate it is that it is not necessarily the mere existence of the institution of the monarchy that is a problem. What becomes a problem is when that institution becomes parasitic and lives a lavish lifestyle at the expense of the nation. Now we talk about health crisis, we have rightly mentioned education crisis, we have rightly mentioned the issue that there's been no raises of wages for public sector workers. So everyone understands that where we are today, precisely because we've got a playboy king who believes that all the national resources must go into financing his lifestyle and that of these wives and kids. And everyone
not disrespectful calling the king a playboy?
Why would I respect someone who doesn't respect us as a nation? I think one of the things that we must be clear on, Sakina, is that Swaziland as a monarch, not that the monarch as a country. We do not belong to the king. We are not subjects of the king. We are citizens of that country.
But you are subjects of the king.
No.
By virtue of him being the monarch and Swaziland being an absolute monarchy, you are subjects of the king.
No, we're citizens of the country. We're not a subject of the king. The king is there because the people wanted to have a monarchy. But I'm saying it is exactly the same people who have saying after our experience with what it entails having a monarchy, it looks like our lives are going to be far better without this man there.
So I'm very curious about these reforms that you are talking about a nation that is perhaps becoming tired of seeing the lavishes of the monarchy as opposed to and juxtaposed to the shortcomings that you see at the state level where people are suffering. So what sort of engagements would you have with the monarch in terms of these reforms?
Well, if and when it decides to engage with us, our demands have always been very clear. First and foremost is that we need the opening up of the political space in Swaziland. Like I have said earlier, we need to make sure that power shifts from the monarch to the people. We need multi-party democracy in Swaziland. We need to allow the Swazi citizens to choose a government of their choice, not the issue where the monarch decides on who must constitute the executive. So once the power shifts to the people of Swaziland in their wisdom are going to be able to choose a political party that is going to represent their interest and that is going to look after their needs.
But would the monarch play a role in whatever sort of evolution takes place within the Swati political space? One would imagine he would have to, given the powers that he holds right now.
Yeah, we believe that could be an outcome of the engagement. But what we've always said is that there are democratic nations in the world that do still have the institution of the monarch in place. But what is different is that it's not an absolute monarch. It is not a monarch that it raids public purse to finance his lifestyle and that of his family. So the issue of do we retain the monarch or we don't retain the monarch is going to be decided in those engagements that will be taking place between the parties. Like I said earlier, it is not necessarily the mere existence of the institution that becomes a problem for us. It is how this institution has become so parasitic that an entire nation is being collapsed to finance a lavish lifestyle of one man and his bevy and kids.
And perhaps just also to bring up to speed those who may not be au fait with this particular development. So there was the purchase of the 19 Rolls Royce vehicles, and in addition to that, about 120 BMWs were also purchased. And we're told that this is for the exclusive use of the king and his family. Is that correct?
Well, that is largely correct. Though government through the Ministry of Public Works has come out to say some of the BMW purchases were for the royal escort. But either way, it still goes about all into making sure that both the security and the lifestyle of one individual is being taken care of. And what it becomes even more annoying about this whole thing is that it takes place at the back of, like you're saying, students have not received their increases for months. The pensioners in Swaziland go about without receiving their pension because government says it doesn't have resources. There is grave shortages of critical chronic medication in public hospitals. And simultaneously, as we see this lavish acquisition, we see increases in taxation. There's been a 100% increase on road toll taxes. The bread price have increased. There've been an increase of almost 1 malangeni for fuel and a variety of other increases. It is said that electricity will be going up by almost 33%. The public transport operators are meeting today to finalize another increase on public transport costs. So all these things are meant to take money from the poorest of the poor and the already struggling nation of Swaziland to finance this lavish lifestyle. So we're not talking about a nation here that is spending money because it has some extra reserves. We're talking about a nation that is spending money that it doesn't have, that it has borrowed, and that is also taking through overtaxation of poor Swazi people.
Well, it's also been reported that the government of Eswatini are looking for an $83 million loan to complete the building of a conference center to host the AU summit. So is there any truth to that as far as you know?
It is absolutely true. It is absolutely true. Not so long ago, the minister did introduced, and it was approved by Parliament, because we don't also have a Parliament there, an appropriation bill that allowed him to go and borrow those sort of responses. And it was what I was referring you to earlier when I said the initial costs was said to be 2.2 billion. The latest information from government says we're currently seated at 5.7 billion rands. So yes, that country has been living through loans throughout. And the little that it collects through taxes goes to be spent on the king and on his endless international trips with a lot of useless people that are masquerading as nannies.
So it raises so many questions, because on the one hand you are buying luxury vehicles, on the other hand you're out to borrow to basically spend on capex. So how is the international world supposed to view all of this that's going on in Swaziland?
We're quite encouraged actually, because the Americans were the first one to come out. If you were to see yesterday's newspapers from Swaziland, the American ambassador is on record having said America will have to reconsider all the assistance, the aid and loans that it gives to the country, looking at how the country is spending lavishly on the lifestyle of the king. But we want to call upon, in particular, South Africa, because you see, what is quite interesting is that all these acquisitions, if we, for instance, we talk about the BMWs, they were bought from a South African dealership here in Johannesburg, BMW dealership. One of the things that we've been lobbying South Africa on is that we need to consider targeted sanctions on Swaziland, in particular on the king, so that you do not become an accomplice in the raiding and impoverishment of the Swazi people by boosting sales of South African private sector at the expense of the dying Swazi nation.
That's an interesting perspective. Have you engaged anyone in South Africa on that particular matter?
Yes, we have, and we will continue to engage them. It is precisely for that reason.
What's been the response?
That amongst the places where the march of Wednesday will be going to, it will be going to the South African High Commission in Babane, because we are bringing this thing to the South African government and the private sector. We will also be targeting, by the way, those individual companies that you find that they operate in Swaziland, that are South African companies that have become accomplices in the issue of the raiding of the Swazi national purse, as it were.
So we've spoken to the monarchy, but the Prime Minister, what's the role of the Prime Minister in Eswatini?
Well, the Prime Minister is just a statue that was put there by the king. He just went and fetched a man who had never been involved in politics, who was in the private sector. He's as confused as many people are about what is happening. He came in there with a lot of enthusiasm, developed what he called an economic recovery roadmap, and none of the things that have been mentioned there have taken place, precisely because only when he was in there, he realized that no, it's not him who's going to make the call. So it is for that reason when he's asked about these things, he has decided to go undercover, because he doesn't know what to say. He has no explanation to the nation what is happening. And the reality is that all powers in that country, executive, legislative, and judicial, rest with one man, the monarchy.
So, PUDEMO, yes. You were established in 1983, if I'm not mistaken.
That's correct.
How has the Swati political landscape changed since then? What have been the gains, that have been made for and on behalf of the people by yourself since then?
We've made quite a very impressive gains, even if we were to say so ourselves, because you remember when we were established, trade union movements were not allowed in Swaziland. When we were established, there was no direct election of representatives into parliament in Swaziland. What was in existence was that there was an electoral college where people will elect, and then a council of princes and chiefs will then decide from whoever that had been forwarded by constituencies that should go to parliament. So there have been a number of reforms that have taken place as a result of the pressure that we've put in. There was no constitution. Of course, we're still not happy with the 2005 constitution, but it was a milestone from where we're coming from, because we're under 1973 decree, and those things did not just fall from the sky, Sakina. They were outcomes of sustained struggles led by PUDEMO.
And you said earlier that you just returned to South Africa this morning, early hours of this morning.
Yes.
We understood there was a meeting that was supposed to take place over the weekend of civil society groupings. What came out of that?
What came out of the meeting is a resolution that we need to confront the elephant in the room. So everyone agreed that let's stop focusing on these sectoral issues as if the issue is about COLA, as if the issue is about payment of student allowances. The issue is about the fact that we have a monarch who is raiding the public purse, and all of us need to confront that problem. So what came out is that we are going to be starting from this coming Wednesday, embarking on a rolling mass action, a series of protests, a series of activities that aimed to mobilize the people of Swaziland to confront the monarch, to say we want changes in Swaziland and we want them now.
Let's just close it off with some stats very quickly. The unemployment rate in Swaziland at the moment?
The unemployment rate in Swaziland is nearing almost 40%. In particular, amongst young people, it's even higher. So the situation is quite bad in Swaziland. The statistics is that almost 65% of the Swazi population lives below the poverty line. So yeah, the situation is quite dire there.
Debt to GDP ratio?
The debt to GDP ratio is almost approaching 30% now. And the problem is that, we are not talking about a big economy there. It might appear as if it's not much, but when we are talking about the small-sized economy, like the economies in Swaziland, that is very huge. And we are talking about Swaziland, there are very few people who are employed in the formal sector. So most people are trying to earn a living through informal sector in Swaziland. So it is quite terrible. And
the growth of the economy, what rate is that economy growing at the moment?
The economy in the last financial year, it grew at about 1.5%, which is quite a very, very low growth considering the challenges facing the country and, like I said, the size of the economy. But now it is estimated that we are going to grow just below 1%. And this is quite troubling for us, because what we have seen is that there's been a lot of closures, there's been a lot of retrenchments, and many companies have had to close shop. As it stands, government is on record that it owed service providers in Swaziland over 3 billion rand that it was hoping that it would have paid by September, but now the minister have postponed that to next year, March, which we doubt they will be able to meet even that deadline. So yeah, it's quite bad.
So that's where we're going to leave that. Thank you so much for coming through. A snapshot of what's happening in our neighboring Eswatini. Thanks to Mlungisi Makhanya, who is the president of the People's United Democratic Movement in Swaziland, PUDEMO, for chatting to us about the situation of the country under a constitutional monarchy.